Welcome back, everyone. We're starting with Chapter 6, the integumentary system, with this video, Section 6.1, the skin and subcutaneous tissue. The skin, hair, and nails are very important to take note of in a physical exam if you're going into a healthcare field. They can give you signs about illness and disease and overall health. The skin is a very vulnerable organ. It gets exposed to radiation and trauma, and one of its main function is protection from infection. Sometimes that protection is lacking and infections happen anyway. Skin can also be injured by chemicals. More medical treatment is devoted to the skin than any other organ system. That's really interesting. A lot of times we don't think about the skin even as being an organ system. But think about what percentage of emergency room visits happen for burns or to get stitches after some sort of skin injury. And I'm sure you guys have heard of dermatology, which is the study and medical treatment of the integumentary system. This video is about section 6.1. We're going to be talking about the functions of the skin and how those functions relate to the skin structure. We're going to look at the three major layers of the skin, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue. We're going to talk about some normal and pathological or disease-indicating colors that the skin can have and talk about why those colors may happen. And then we're going to look at some of the common markings of the skin, both in healthy and diseased states. So here is kind of a cartoon-like picture of the skin, and we're going to be looking at a lot of these structures in this section and in the rest of the videos for Chapter 6. Today we're going to be focusing on the cells that make up the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. So a little bit of overview about the skin and subcutaneous tissue. So when I say the integumentary system, I mean the skin and what we call the accessory organs, and that involves the hair, the nails, and the glands that we find in the cutaneous and subcutaneous tissue. The skin is actually the body's largest and heaviest organs. 15% of your body weight is accounted for by your skin. And depending on your height and your body mass, your skin is 1.5 to 2 square meters in size. On the previous slide, we looked at the epidermis being the outermost layer, the dermis being the slightly deeper connective tissue layer, and then finally the lowest layer, the hypodermis, which is technically not part of the skin, but is closely associated with the skin. So skin on different parts of our bodies varies in thickness. Our thinnest skin is about 0.5 millimeter thick. We find that especially on like our eyelids. And our thickest skin can be 6 millimeters thick. Quite a difference there. And that thick skin we see like at the bottoms of our feet or on the palms of our hands if we do a lot of work with our hands. So the thick skin has sweat glands, but generally doesn't have any hair follicles or sweat glands. The thin skin does have hair follicles and sweat glands. It's interesting here that the thing that accounts for the differences in thickness is the thickness of the epidermis. So the epidermis is thicker in thick skin as opposed to thin skin. So we know that the skin's job is to prevent trauma and infection. So we have some different ways that it can do that. It has the tough keratin protein. It also has dermacidin and defensins, which are antimicrobial, and also an acid mantle. Your skin secretions are acidic, and that helps prevent a lot of pathogens as well. Your skin is a water barrier. We want to keep the water that's in your body inside your body in most cases. And we also don't want to take in water when it's inappropriate. So your skin is semi-waterproof and prevents too much water from leaving. We do sweat, and there are very good reasons physiologically why we sweat. But our skin prevents water from leaving at a super high rate, also prevents water from coming in. Our skin is a barrier to UV radiation from sunlight and also from harmful chemicals. A lot of people don't realize this, but your skin is the first step, is the location of the first step in production of vitamin D. And vitamin D is very, very important for a lot of different body functions. Vitamin D can be classified as a vitamin, can also be classified as a hormone. It has capabilities as a neurotransmitter in your brain. So it's a very, very important vitamin for us to have. Vitamin D synthesis starts in the skin, but is completed in the liver and kidneys. Your skin allows you the sense of touch. We can feel hot and cold. We can feel smooth or rough textures. We can feel pain from our skin. Skin is involved in regulating our body temperature. Okay, so we have thermoreceptors in our skin that allow us to know if it's hot or cold. Our skin can undergo vasoconstriction or vasodilation, meaning the small veins, arteries, and capillaries in our skin can dilate or constrict, either promoting blood flow or restricting blood flow, and thereby promoting or restricting heat loss. Skin is also involved in perspiration. Your sweat glands are part of your skin. Your skin is also a communicative tool. Your facial expressions, the attachments of your skin to the muscles of your face allow for us to express a wide array of emotions. And our skin is also very important in our image and self-perception. Think of maybe a teenager who has severe acne and what that can do to their confidence level, for instance. Okay, so we're going to start with the outermost surface and then work our way to the deeper levels of the skin tissue. So starting with the epidermis is made of keratinized, stratified squamous. If you don't remember what those words mean, you probably need to take a look back at some of the videos in Chapter 5 and review those terms. Okay, so your epidermis, in addition to a thin layer of living cells, also includes the dead cells on the skin surface that are packed and held there temporarily with the keratin protein. The epidermis does not have any blood vessels. So that means the epidermis has to get its nutrients coming up from the underlying connective tissue. Our epidermis also doesn't have very many nerve endings. We can't feel pain or other sensations with our epidermis. Now we can with our dermis. That's a very different thing. But our epidermis is not very sensitive at all. Our epidermis contains 5 different cell types. Okay, so we have stem cells, which are undifferentiated cells, and we also talked about stem cells extensively in Chapter 5, so take a look back there if you need to. Stem cells are found in the deepest part of the epidermis. We call that the stratum basale. We also have keratinocytes, and most of our epidermis cells fall in this category of keratinocytes. Their job is to synthesize keratin. We have melanocytes. Melanocytes make the pigment melanin. We'll be talking about that quite a bit later in this video. Melanin's job is to protect the DNA from UV radiation. Melanocytes are only found in the stratum basale. and they have kind of branched, almost arm-looking things, kind of star-shaped, so that they can spread out and distribute that melanin across the surface of the skin. Tactile cells, we said that there are a few sensory processing functions of the epidermis. There aren't a whole lot here, but we do have some touch receptors. And then dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are a type of macrophage that come from the bone marrow, and they help to guard against pathogens. So that epidermis layer, that very thin epidermis layer, actually has 4 or 5 layers within it. And these layers are pretty distinct. When we see a slide, we can pick out which layer is what. So thin skin has 4 layers and thick skin has 5 layers. The difference is this stratum lucidum. Okay, we only find that in thick skin. So stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and stratum corneum are found in both thin and thick skin, but stratum lucidium is only found in thick skin. Okay, so starting from the deepest, we have the stratum basale. It's got base in the name, so that might help you remember that. This is the stem cell layer, and it also has the keratinocytes, and it's attached and resting on the basement membrane. The stratum spinosum, okay, this gets its name because they're kind of spiky shaped, spiny shaped. Okay, this is several layers thick of keratinocytes that are held together by desmosomes and tight junctions. We talked about those in Chapter 5. Review those if you don't remember what they mean. Stratum granulosum, we're going to talk about this in more detail a couple slides from now, but this is a thinner layer, only 3 to 5 cells thick, of flat keratinocytes. And then only in the thin skin areas, we have the stratum lucidum. And these are keratinocytes that are packaged with a protein called eludin. And then closest to the surface, we have dead scaly keratinocyte cells. So the idea here is these are going to resist abrasion. If there is an abrasive force on the skin, it'll be these dead layers of skin cells that are affected, not the living healthy cells. These are also going to prevent water loss. So now we're going to talk about how a keratinocyte develops over time. So keratinocytes are produced by mitosis. Stem cells differentiate and undergo mitosis to form this stratum basale layer. And these keratinocytes are going to be formed in that stratum basale, or the second deepest, the stratum spinosum. Mitosis requires oxygen and nutrients. So as these cells get pushed away from that basement membrane, mitosis is not going to happen anymore. Mitosis happens in the deepest part of the epidermis. So as new keratinocytes form in that deepest part of the epidermis, they push the older ones towards the surface. And over time, the ones getting pushed towards the surface, the older ones, they're going to flatten. They're going to produce more of that tough keratin protein, and they're going to have more membrane coating vesicles. It takes about 30 or 40 days for a keratinocyte to go from the deepest stratum basale layer all the way up to the skin surface where it flakes off. So this process takes about a month, sometimes a little more than a month, and it slows down with age. So older people are going to have this process happening slower. When skin is injured or is stressed, this can happen faster. Okay, so if you get a bad sunburn at the beach this weekend or at the pool this weekend, that is going to be injured, stressed skin, and this process is going to happen faster as your skin attempts to heal itself. When we have calluses on our hands or corns on our feet, those are thicknesses of dead keratinocytes that can help protect us or can cause us harm if they're making it difficult to walk and get around. In that stratum granulosum layer, and I said we were going to come back and talk about this in more detail in a minute. In the stratum granulosum layer, we have a couple things happening that are important. Okay, so we have the keratohyalin granules, and they release a protein called filaggrin. And filaggrin is a protein that's going to bind with the keratin and make very tough bundles that are going to have that protective function. These cells have a tough envelope of proteins just inside of their plasma membranes, and they're going to have some waterproofing ability as the membrane coating vesicles release some lipids. As the keratinocytes get old and eventually die, some of their organelles are going to degenerate. The epidermis also works as a water barrier. It prevents dehydration, and that function comes from the tight junctions between skin cells. All right, now we're moving on to the dermis. This is the second deepest layer. So we talked about the epidermis, the outermost layer. Now we're talking about the dermis, the second deepest layer. And we said that the dermis varies in thickness from very thin to much thicker, depending on what part of the body that we're talking about. The dermis is primarily made of collagen. Collagen is that tough connective tissue protein that we talked about in chapter 5. So the dermis is going to be collagen rich. The dermis has a lot of blood vessels. It also is the place of the sweat glands and the sebaceous glands and the nerve endings. All those things are found in the dermis. So the epidermis didn't have blood vessels, didn't have sweat glands, had very few nerve endings. Our dermis is the location of all those. The dermis also has hair follicles and the roots of your finger and toenails. The dermis is going to be connecting with the skeletal muscles that allow you to have facial expressions. And we actually have a couple different layers within the dermis tissue that can be distinguished. Okay, so here are these two layers within the dermis that we can see specifically. So we have the papillary layer. This is the uppermost part of the dermis tissue, close to the epidermis. This is going to be less dense. It's the areolar tissue that we talked about again in chapter 5. We're going to have leukocytes, white blood cells that are able to move around in this less dense tissue. It also has a significant number of blood vessels. The reticular layer is the deeper part of the dermis, so it has more dense and irregular connective tissue. We saw some pictures of this in chapter 5. Check back there if you need to. And if you have ever been pregnant or gained weight or know someone who has stretch marks, this is the layer that is damaged by the collagen fibers stretching as the skin needs to stretch to accommodate a change in a person's size. So, epidermis, close to the surface. Dermis, next layer down. One layer down from the dermis is the hypodermis. Hypo means lower, so hypodermis, below the dermis. This is the subcutaneous tissue. It has more adipose or fat tissue than the dermis did. This provides padding. It's a place where the skin can bind together with the underlying tissues. This is also where we give many medications because of its proximity to blood vessels. Below that, we have subcutaneous fat. This is the energy reservoir. This is thermal insulation. Physiologically, women have more of this than men, and it's thinner in infants and elderly people.